Story 1. This happened back in 2020 during a hike I took in New Mexico. The trail went through a short bit of desert, then open medium-sized mountain that led to a canyon-like walkthrough at the top. Going for 8 to 10 hour hikes alone was my way of clearing my mind and getting away from the stress of everyday life. Anyways, the trail didn't seem to be well known as there wasn't any parking nearby, and the trailhead was really hard to find. It was hidden behind a line of thick bushes, and the path was faint and faded. I never really specifically looked for low-traffic trails, but I didn't like running into people all the time on high-traffic trails either, so I was fine with the path being unknown. As I continued down the trail, the trees began to look more and more dry until most of them just seemed dead. Many had fallen over the trail or had multiple thick branches falling off. The trail definitely hadn't been taken care of in the past few years. Making my way further down the path began to lead through layers of thick overgrown bushes. The path was distinct enough to know that I was still on the trail, though so I kept going. That's when I heard a very distinct sound. A whistle coming from up the mountain. It was faint, but I could hear the whistling hold a few notes before it stopped. I'll admit it was creepy and made me pretty uncomfortable, but I just figured someone else was on the trail. In the moment, that was the only thing that made sense. Another 20 minutes go by and again I hear the same melodic whistle, but this time much closer and louder. I was a little more creeped out this time, but I wasn't about to leave the trail just because of some guy whistling nearby. I went up about a quarter mile further, keeping my pocket knife in my hand just in case. A tree had fallen right on the path though, and the thorny branches made it difficult to climb over, so I had to walk around it. I turned to the right and took a couple steps before noticing a small valley, likely where a river used to flow. However, right in the middle was a small den made of large sticks. For the complexity of it, I knew it had to be man-made. I started putting the whistling and the den together, figuring someone might actually be living here. I got a bad feeling about the whole thing and decided I needed to go right away. But just as I turned to leave the valley, that same whistle came from right behind me. I felt my heart stop out of fear as I quickly turned to face the den. To my surprise, there was a large goat standing just behind the valley exactly where I heard the whistle from. Its eyes felt like they were staring into me as it stood there motionless. I also couldn't help but notice how large it was compared to other ones that I'd seen around the area. I was really freaking out in my head at this point and couldn't even comprehend the whole situation. After a few seconds, I managed to control myself and began walking back slowly, still facing it. But as I took one step back, it opened its mouth slightly and unnaturally. Then it let out the same whistle I'd heard too many times already. My fear took hold and I sprinted down the mountain, falling multiple times over trees and rocks. I heard the whistle one more time, softly echoing down the mountain as I made it to the exit of the trail. I'd never told anyone about my encounter as I thought nobody would ever believe me and I'd only sound like a coward. But I hadn't heard about skinwalkers until recently, and as soon as I dove deeper into them, I realized that may be the only possible explanation for what I saw. Skinwalkers are figures in Navajo legend that have the supernatural ability to shapeshift into animals or even other people. They are witches that broke from the Navajo way and use their powers to cause harm. Many Navajo believe they walk among us undetected, spreading evil. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that I had encountered a skinwalker on that hike. The whistling to lure me in, the unnatural size and stillness of the goat, and the human-like ways it moved and sounded were all signs. I couldn't stop thinking about its eyes and the fear I felt, like it was peering into my soul. Why it let me go, I'll never know. Maybe I escaped its trap or wasn't what it was looking for. All I know is the paralyzing terror I experienced on that trail, and the feeling that it wanted something from me, something sinister. I became obsessed, scouring the internet for skinwalker encounters. The descriptions were all too familiar: shape-shifting, animal noises used to lure people, a sense of being stalked. I learned that whistling back shows you're not afraid and can break their spell. If only I had known. Late at night, I'd jolt awake hearing faint whistles outside my window. I knew it was out there waiting for me, During the day, stray dogs and coyotes in town seemed to follow me, their eyes knowing more than they should. I stopped going on hikes alone. The fear was too much even in groups. I could sense its presence in the bushes just beyond view. A panic would come over me, and we turned back. It was biding its time. After months of this lurking dread, I decided I had to confront it. I returned to that trail on a full moon night, knife in hand. The whistling started as soon as the car door slammed. It knew I was there. Heart pounding, I followed the sound through the dead trees and brush. The trail was even more overgrown than before. I pushed through vines and thorns that tore my clothes and skin. The whispers grew louder, circling around me. In a clearing I saw it, the large goat standing motionless, eyes reflecting the moonlight. I walked slowly towards it, willing myself to stay calm. It opened its mouth and let out a deafening whistle, shaking me to my core. I answered back with a piercing whistle of my own. The animal jolted, clearly not expecting this. It started morphing before my eyes, skin rippling, limbs cracking, becoming taller and more human, but still not fully formed. A raspy voice escaped. "What do you want from me?" My knife shook in my hand, but I stood firm. "I want you to leave me alone. Forever." It laughed, still changing shape. "I will never leave. You tried to escape, but you only made it worse." Fury rose inside me. This thing had tormented me for months, invading my sleep, filling me with terror. I rushed forward, plunging my knife into its chest over and over, black blood spilling out, covering me. It shrieked an unearthly wail, body convulsing. I stabbed again and again until it lay lifeless on the ground. The world was silent. I had killed a Skinwalker. Its evil could haunt me no more. Story 2. For nearly a decade, I lived with my wife Clara and 2 children, Henry and Alive, in a remote cabin deep in the Canadian wilderness. It was an idyllic existence, just our little family thriving off a land enveloped by the peaceful forest. Our cabin was extremely isolated, accessible only by the network of faint footpaths we and our few neighbors had worn connecting our remote homesteads over the years. We were self-sufficient farmers, growing vegetables and raising livestock. Our children knew no other life than this tranquil, wholesome one. But after many uneventful years, our off-the-grid paradise was shattered unexpectedly one night. I was up late reading in the living room when I heard our cattle outside suddenly stirring in a panic. Highly peculiar behavior this late. Looking out the window towards the pasture, I could just make out the herd huddled tightly on the far side, as if fleeing from some unseen threat. Scanning the moonlit field, I noticed a huge deer halfway obscured behind a tree, stock still, facing the cabin. Though distant, I could feel its dark gaze cutting through me. The cattle's terror of mere prey confused me, but I wrote it off and returned to my book, admittedly unsettled. Weeks later, I was startled awake by Clara frantically shaking me, eyes brimming with fear. She whispered urgently for me to listen. Something was encircling the cabin, deliberately dragging sticks along the outside walls. I heard its chillingly methodical movements, taunting us. The air grew heavy with dread. After completing its full orbit, the disturbances ceased. I rushed to confirm the kids were unharmed, then armed myself with my rifle to inspect each window. Only the faintest rustling of leaves permeated the silence. But peering out our bedroom window, I saw it again. The massive deer standing motionless in the woods watching. A primal sense of unease washed over me. I closed the curtains and waited anxiously for sunrise, rifle clutched in my hands. Come morning, I instructed Clara to stay inside with Henry and Alive and keep all entrances locked. I needed answers. I set off on the long walk to confer with our neighbor James about these bizarre occurrences. The entire journey, my mind raced for rational explanations, yet I only felt more perturbed. About halfway there, I heard leaves crunching behind me. Whirling around, I came face to face with that very deer from my backyard, standing inches away on the trail, studying me with its jet black eyes. My blood ran cold. Its eyes were unlike any deer's I'd seen. circled in white with abnormally small pupils, disconcertingly human. I turned and fled in a panic, my skeptic worldview shaken. Bursting into James' cabin in near hysterics. He listened bravely as I described my family's ordeal. To my dismay, he barely reacted, as if resigned to some bleak truth. Somberly, James revealed his belief that we were dealing with a Skinwalker, a vengeful Navajo witch capable of transforming into animals. He said they reveal themselves to those who have disturbed them, or if they want something. His apparent sincerity amplified my dread tenfold. I hurried home, praying the creature wouldn't return. Over the next few weeks, I was consumed with paranoia, getting little sleep. But in time, when nothing occurred, I convinced myself it was simply an anomaly of nature, a sick deer wandering too close. We eventually moved closer to town for the children's benefit. That was 15 years ago. I've never shared the full truth about what happened with anyone, even Clara. Some primal instinct stops me. I'm still conflicted if what I witnessed was real or some manifestation of my deepest fears. Perhaps it was merely a deer, and I imagined the humanistic eyes and other oddities in my panic. Maybe it was simply hallucinations brought on by the isolation. I'll never know for sure. But putting this experience into words has lifted a weight off me I've carried since that fateful hike. There were a few other uncanny events preceding that encounter which I omitted from the version I told James. I feel I should document them now, if only to make sense of it myself. The first occurred a few weeks prior to that night Clara awoke me. As I was reading late into the evening, I heard the cattle outside suddenly begin panicking and stampeding about the pasture. Highly abnormal behavior, especially this late. Looking outside, I noticed they were tightly packed on the far side of the field. Scanning with my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of an enormous hulking creature on two legs lurking behind a distant tree. It appeared to be watching the cabin intently. Unsettled, I swiftly closed the curtain and retreated back inside, glancing back frequently to ensure it wasn't of the windows. Later, I convinced myself it must have been a bear up on its hind legs. We did occasionally have black bear sightings in the surrounding woods. Something about the fluid way it moved didn't seem natural for a bear. The second strange event was a few days after the deer encounter, when I returned from conferring with James. Late that night, I woke to use the outhouse around back. Still shaken by recent events, I brought my rifle along. As I finished my business, I heard a blood-curdling scream echo from the direction of James' cabin off in the distance, like a woman being murdered. Every hair on my neck stood up. I sprinted back inside to check on my family. Clara was soundly asleep. Slamming the door behind me, I shoved our dresser in front of it and sat with my gun pointed at it until sunrise, clinging to my terrified family. We were all on edge for weeks after. But when I later mentioned it to James in passing, he said he heard nothing unusual that night. Looking back now, I can't explain these occurrences within the bounds of reason. Perhaps it was all just vivid nightmares and rages fabricated by my imagination. If skinwalkers are real, some primal gut instinct tells me I'm better off not knowing for sure. But writing this has lifted the burden I've carried, despite how absurd it may seem. I can only hope putting these memories to paper can finally sever their clinging grip on my psyche. The darkness in those woods invaded our sanctuary of light for a time, but no more. Our family survived, and that's what matters. Story 3. Every summer growing up, my family would go on a camping trip to northern Wisconsin with our close friends the Wilsons. And each year, my dad Dave and his best buddy Walt would take me, my sister Stacy, and all the other kids on a supposed snipe hunt out in the woods. For anyone unfamiliar, a snipe hunt is basically a prank played on gullible kids. Snipes aren't actually real creatures. As described by my dad and Walt, they were like monstrous bird beasts that came out at night and attacked campers. Of course, my sister and I totally fell for it being young kids. The trip, when I was 8 years old, started out like any other. After getting settled into the campgrounds day one, my dad and Walt immediately began planting the seeds for that night's big snipe hunt, telling us kids they heard strange noises right outside the RVs the previous night that could only be from snipes. Stacy and I could barely contain our excitement leading up to that night. We just knew this would be the year we finally see a real-life snipe. As soon as the sun started going down, my dad gathered all his kids by the fire to prepare us for the hunt. Some of the older kids were carrying big sticks or toy swords for battling the snipes. My dad said Walt had gone ahead to track where the snipes might be hiding. And so our group set off into the dark woods, my sister and I leading the pack, vibrating with anticipation. After about 10 minutes of hiking, we suddenly heard loud rustling up in the trees above us. All of a sudden, Walt comes crashing out of the bushes, clothes tattered and stained red, screaming that a snipe had attacked him. All us kids totally freaked out and went bolting in different directions, yelling our heads off. At 8 years old, I didn't realize it was just a prank. I legit thought Walt had been mauled by a snipe. I just started sprinting blindly through the woods in sheer terror. I ran until I came upon a large oak tree surrounded by bushes that I dove behind for cover. Crouched there shaking, heart feeling like it would beat out of my chest, I tried to stay as quiet as possible. After a few minutes, I slowly peered out from my hiding spot, leaves crunching nearby. But when I looked up, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Lurking not far away was a creature I can only describe as some kind of emaciated humanoid dog hybrid. It had long, skinny limbs and a distorted, mangy head with only patches of coarse fur on its bony body. I sat paralyzed in horror watching it skulk by, letting out these unnatural whimpers that sounded almost human. I had no idea what this thing was, but its presence filled me with an overwhelming sensation of dread and wrongness. I couldn't tear my eyes away as it shuffled past my location. Then suddenly it turned and looked right at me, its eyes meeting mine. That image will be forever seared into my memory. My skin crawled at its intelligence and cunning. After what seemed like an eternity, it finally passed and disappeared into the night. Just then, I heard my dad's distant voice calling out for me. The creature froze and glanced back at me one last time before vanishing silently into the darkness. Seconds later, my dad grabbed my arm, angry that I had run off so far. I was hysterical, trying to tell him about the monster, but he dismissed it as my imagination and scolded me the whole way back to camp. But I knew what I saw was real. It wasn't until I was older and came across stories of Alleged Skinwalkers that I considered it may have actually been one of these shape-shifting witches. I guess I'll never know for sure, but I'll never forget that night. Ever since that fateful snipe hunt, I've been haunted by what I can only assume was a skinwalker lurking in those Wisconsin woods. I have regular nightmares where I'm being chased through the forest by a snarling, shambling beast on 2 legs. When I'm outside at night, I often hear strange cries or see odd shapes darting just out of sight. A primal instinct tells me it's still out there, watching and waiting. I avoided camping for years until just recently, when I returned to those same Wisconsin woods with some friends. Against my better judgment, I didn't tell them about my encounter as a kid. The first couple nights were uneventful. Then on the 3rd night, we were sitting around the campfire when the woods suddenly went dead silent. All the normal nighttime sounds of insects and animals ceased entirely. A chill went down my spine as the fire flickered oddly low. I heard it before I saw it. A distant, familiar whimper. Then movement in the darkness. 2 pinpricks of light peering out from the black tree line. I was frozen in terror once again. Before I could react, a monstrous creature emerged into the firelight. My friends all screamed as the hulking, malformed beast stood on its hind legs, at least 8 feet tall, and unleashed an unnatural guttural cry. Chaos ensued. My friends scrambled in all directions while I sat paralyzed by childhood memories flooding back. The creature lowered its gaze directly at me, eyes glowing, and crept closer, letting out excited whimpers, almost like laughter. Coming back to my senses, I jumped up and yelled for my friends to regroup. Grabbing flashlights and knives, we faced the beast as it approached. It paused, seeming surprised by our boldness. We advanced together, surrounding it. It swiftly retreated into the darkness, but we gave chase this time, emboldened by anger. We tracked it through the woods until we arrived at an old abandoned mine. Exchanging determined looks, we cautiously entered the mine, makeshift weapons raised. Inside, we discovered a grisly scene. Bones, tattered clothing, and dismembered bodies scattered around a foul lair. The creature lurched out from the shadows, startling us. But we stood our ground, striking out with knives when it charged. It was slow and clumsy in the enclosed space. We slashed at its legs and body, blackish blood spraying. With a final desperate cry, it collapsed to the ground. The creature that haunted my life was finally dead. We burned its foul nest and reported the grisly scene to authorities. I'll never know if it really was a skinwalker or something else entirely. But that night, after 20 long years, I finally overcame my childhood nightmare. Never again will it stalk me or any others in those dark Wisconsin woods.